North Korea, the US, Japan, and several other countries initiate a new mechanism to keep track of North Korea slipping through the net to violate UN sanctions as an alternative to the now defunct UN panel of experts. Polls just closed for by-elections. It's a small election to decide Seoul's education chief as well as heads of 4 local governments, but its political impact could mean a great deal. Employment expanded by over 100,000 from the previous year in September, with uneven job growth across industries and age groups. It's October 16th, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. A sanctions monitoring system on North Korea is back on. A group of countries, including South Korea, the US, and Japan, have announced a fresh initiative to monitor UN sanctions on the regime. This follows Russia opposing the renewal of a related panel at the United Nations. Our foreign affairs correspondent Pyongyang has our top story.
In March, Russia blocked the renewal of a panel of experts that oversees the enforcement of United Nations sanctions on North Korea's nuclear programs. It vetoed a 1-year extension, bringing an end to the group's 15 years of operation, leading to strong criticism from South Korea and other countries. Since then, Seoul has been working with Washington and other like-minded nations on ways to find a replacement, including creating a framework outside of the United Nations. And on Wednesday, South Korea's first Vice Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun and his American and Japanese counterparts, Kurt Campbell and Masataka Okano, who met in Seoul on Wednesday, announced that the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, or MSMT, will be established to help fill the void in monitoring North Korea-related sanctions.
In light of the veto, which disbanded the UN Security Council's 1718 committee panel of experts this year, we hereby express our intention to establish the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, MSMT, a multilateral mechanism to monitor and report violations and evasions of the sanctions measures stipulated in the relevant UNSCRs.
For now, South Korea, the US, Japan, as well as 8 other countries, including France, the UK, and Germany, have decided to join the initiative, and the 3 officials call for more support from other UN member states. The goal of the MSMT is to publicly report on the implementation of UN sanctions on North Korea, issuing critical reports on a wide range of topics, including North Korea's illicit cyber activities and maritime sanctions evasion activities. Calling this a remarkable achievement, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State said Russia and China's failure to support the renewal of the UN panel of experts will not stop other countries from monitoring North Korea's actions.
We are here to make sure that their efforts will not prevent public reporting on sanctions violations and evasion of activities that generate revenue for the DPRK's unlawful and destabilizing WMD and ballistic missile programs.
The UN panel of experts have published reports twice a year, but South Korea's foreign ministry said that in addition to the regular reports, the MSMT is also considering issuing separate detailed reports on specific issues from time to time and present them in public briefings at the Security Council. Pyongyang, Arirang News.
Breaking away from its pattern, North Korea's state media is yet to carry coverage of the regime's recent detonation of the land links to South Korea. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung explains what could be the reason.
North Korea staying silent about its blowing up of inter-Korean roads on Tuesday. The North's main newspaper, the Nodongshinmun, did not carry any reports about the destruction of the cross-border roads that were once seen as a symbol of inter-Korean cooperation. Usually, the state-run news agency for readers outside North Korea, the Korean Central News Agency, runs reports of the outcomes of the major events early the next day. But as of Tuesday morning, the KCNA did not have any news either. This is in contrast to a previous case when the state media reported the North's demolition of the Joint Liaison Office in Kaesong in June 2020. At that time, the KCNA promptly reported the news on the same day, while the 노동신문 carried the report the following day. An expert says the regime is trying to assess the situation.
Up until now, North Korea has been pushing hard, issuing statements, taking military actions, and informing their citizens through state media. It seems like they are now taking a moment to see the reaction of its own people, South Korea, and the international community, including the U.S., before deciding to keep going.
Washington, on the other hand, voiced its concerns, with the State Department urging North Korea on Tuesday to stop actions that would increase the risk of conflict, while reiterating calls for Pyongyang to come back to diplomacy. A State Department spokesperson also added that Washington is monitoring the situation in the north in close coordination with South Korea. Meanwhile, group tours around the demilitarized zone, which were temporarily suspended on Tuesday following a request from the South Korean army, resumed on Wednesday after a risk assessment. The tourist sites include the Tora Observatory in Paju, along with the Gosang Unification Observation Tower in Gangwon-do Province, locations where visitors can tour the DMZ area. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
In another clear sign of closer Russia-North Korea ties, the latest Ukrainian reports say Pyongyang is sending thousands of North Korean troops to Russia for fighting. Cha Yun-kyung has more.
Major Ukrainian media outlets reported on Tuesday local time, citing military sources, that Russia has formed a special battalion of 3,000 North Korean troops. It added that the battalion could be deployed to Kursk Oblast in Russia to fight off the Ukrainian offensive, and that North Korea has supplied them with ammunition. The Kyiv Independent newspaper, citing Western sources, reports that North Korea has sent 10,000 soldiers to Russia in total, while Suspin, citing unnamed intelligence officials, reported that the Russian army began tracing the whereabouts of 18 North Korean soldiers who had been deployed to the Russian border but have since deserted. Ukrainian media also reported that 6 North Korean soldiers were among the 20 or so killed in a missile attack in the Donetsk region earlier this month, fueling reports that North Korea sent 3,000 soldiers to fight alongside Russia in that conflict.
Among the main issues was a report from the intelligence services, the Foreign Intelligence Service and the GUR, military intelligence, regarding the intentions of the Russians for autumn and winter. Everything is quite detailed, the effective involvement of North Korea in the war.
The Kremlin has dismissed the claims as a fake news story. On the other hand, White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby said the confirmation of North Korean soldiers fighting on Russia's side can only be classified as a new level of desperation by Putin as he continues to try to make progress in Ukraine, in addition to the deepening relations between Russia and North Korea. Meanwhile, Washington said while it was concerned about the reports, it did not independently confirm them. There is concern within the U.S. military command regarding North Korean troops raising their combat capabilities through actual fighting. Cha Yun-kyung, Arirang News.
Voting closed a short while ago for by-elections here in Korea, choosing Seoul's new superintendent for education and the heads of 4 local governments. The winners are expected to be revealed later tonight. For more, our political correspondent Lee Si-hoo is standing by live. Si-hoo, how is the voter turnout looking?
Jung-min, as you said, the polls just closed for this October's by-elections, the first voting since April's general election. Polling began at 6 this morning, and if you look at the map right here, voters cast their ballots to pick new leaders in these regions. They voted for an education superintendent in the capital Seoul and the heads of districts in the cities of Busan and Incheon, and 2 counties in Jeollanam-do Province. They are Yeonggwang and Gokseong-gun counties. Now, as of 7:30 this evening, just 30 minutes before closing, the turnout was 21.6% in Seoul, and it combined 52.4% for the rest. The turnout for the superintendent is just 0.4% above the record low from 2009, but the turnout for the rest exceeds the average for most recent years. But we have to note that for this election, the voting hours were extended by 2 hours until 8 o'clock to give people enough time to vote because today wasn't an official public holiday. So we expect more people to have voted in the final hour before closing, after they got off work and before they headed home for the evening.
When do we expect to hear the final results, and what's the significance of this fall's by-elections?
Right, so it will be several hours before all the ballots from today and also 2 days of early voting last week are tallied. And it'll be at least near midnight tonight until we hear the final winners announced. As I said earlier, this election is the first to take place following the general election. So this time, the ruling People Power Party and the main opposition Democratic Party are up against each other once again in some of the most politically divided regions in the country, the traditionally conservative city of Busan, and on the other hand, the traditionally liberal province of Jeollanam-do. The strength and ability of the rival parties' leaderships are also being tested through this election, and so they have to put in special efforts to win votes in these regions, traveling far and often to meet local residents. Let's listen to their final pleas for votes from this morning.
This election decides the local servants who will begin working immediately tomorrow. Please exercise your right to vote by voting for the candidates who will do their job right.
We citizens must all go out and vote. Living our own lives is important, but the world can change entirely depending on who manages the government and administration.
Now, tonight's winners will serve the remainder of the term for each vacancy through to the first half of 2026. Jung-min.
All right, that was our political correspondent Lee Si-hoo live from the National Assembly. Thank you. On the economic front, employment expanded by well over 100,000 jobs in September, with senior workers actively seeking to join the workforce, while those in their 20s and 40s stayed on the sidelines. Our Lee Soo-jin covers these findings.
Employment in South Korea increased by more than 100,000 on year for the third straight month in September. Data released by Statistics Korea on Wednesday showed that there were 28.84 million people in employment last month, up 144,000 from the previous year. The on-year job growth recovered to the 100,000 range in July and has stayed there for 3 consecutive months. But job growth was uneven across both industries and age groups. The increase last month was most prominent in the information and communication sector, with the figure going up by 105,000 on year. But the wholesale and retail sector fell by 104,000, the 7th straight month of decline and the sharpest decline since November 2021. The construction sector also fell by 100,000, the 5th straight fall and the largest drop since 2013, when relevant data for the sector was first compiled.
The construction sector is sluggish because of raw material costs and the decline in new construction. The wholesale and retail sector has been seeing a downward trend due to unmanned kiosks and online shopping.
By age group, job growth was mainly driven by those aged 60 and above, with 272,000 more people of that age in jobs compared to last year. Those in their 30s and 50s also saw job growth, but the job figures fell for those aged 15 to 29, as well as those in their 40s. In a ministerial economic meeting on Wednesday, the finance minister acknowledged a drop in employment in the construction sector and among young people, pledging to carry out more measures.
We have plans to improve the work environment for skilled construction workers to attract new workers to the industry, which has been experiencing a decline in employment. Employment training for young people will also be expanded.
He added that the government will also build an industrial ecosystem where companies have the capacity to continuously create quality jobs. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Sales of books by author Kang have soared past 1 million following her winning of this year's Nobel Prize for Literature. Han has kept her media engagement to a minimum by sharing her desire to simply and quietly write stories. Park Go-nu tells us more.
The books of South Korea's first Nobel Literature Prize winner Kang are selling at an unprecedented speed. According to 3 major Korean bookstore chains as of 9 a.m. Wednesday, throughout the 6 days following the Nobel Prize win, over 1 million copies of Han Kang's books have been sold. It's reportedly unusual for several books by a single author that aren't new releases to have this many copies sold within a week. Sales of ebook versions reached around 70,000 during the same period. Along with their acclaimed literary work, The Vegetarian, Human Acts, and We Do Not Part have made up the top 3 most sold.
It's an unprecedented record because it's a challenge in itself to surpass 1 million copies in the digital era, compared to when it was common in the 80s and 90s. This goes beyond people just wanting to read the novel and shows their strong desire to own the actual book. The author's new releases will probably see increases in sales as well.
Despite her popularity, Han, during an interview with Swedish public service television company SVT, said that she doesn't want the spotlight and wants to stay quiet and peacefully thinking about the meaning of the prize. She also says she would like to concentrate on finishing her new novel and then writing her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Han is set to receive her Nobel Prize in Literature at the ceremony held in Sweden on December 10th. Park Go-nu, Arirang News.
Concerns over deepfake sex crimes have led to pledges of tougher penalties to punish and prevent such offenses. Now, what's the road ahead? To delve into this topic, we have our political correspondent Shin Ha-young here in the studio. Hi, Ha-young.
Good evening, Jung-min.
Evening, and deepfake sex crimes are such a big issue worldwide, and it's pretty much the same here in Korea.
You're right, Jung-min. In fact, over half of the global victims of deepfake sex crimes between July and August last year were Korean. And with foreign media also paying attention to South Korea's response, various measures are being introduced. And recently, I had the chance to talk about the measures with a representative from a victim advocacy center and an expert on these crimes. Let's first take a look. Most suspects in deepfake sex crimes in South Korea are classmates of the victims. Young victims often continue to face their perpetrators even after reporting the crimes due to limited punitive measures. This is according to an official from the state-run advocacy center for online sexual abuse victims, highlighting that most of those seeking support are teenagers. Data from the Korean National Police Agency shows nearly 60% of victims reported between 2021 and last year were in their teens. Amid the rise in these crimes, victims commonly pointed out the lack of adequate punishments for offenders.
We surveyed 100 victims, and their biggest challenge was getting the content completely removed. Another issue was the lack of punishment for offenders. Victims feel that proper education and punishment are needed to help eliminate these crimes.
In response, the cabinet last week gave the green light to a bundle of amendments passed by the National Assembly that will impose tougher punishment for deepfake pornography. Under the revised measures, those who own or watch such content will face up to 3 years in prison or a fine of 30 million Korean won or around $22,000, while creators and distributors will also face harsher penalties than they do now. Police will be allowed to start emergency identity non-disclosure investigations into sex offenses against minors without prior approval. To better support victims, a legal basis will be established to expand and operate the advocacy center nationwide. An expert said other measures are also needed to ensure the strengthened penalties are effective.
To ensure punishment, we need to improve the efficiency of arrests and provide legal support that addresses the anonymity of deepfake sex crimes. This includes expanding the range of undercover investigations and supporting the officers involved. A coordinated government approach is needed, including preventive education.
The official from the Advocacy Center welcomed the move but also called for expanding undercover investigations to include adult victims.
Victims often only find out about the crime long after it occurs, leaving them frustrated as they can't track where the content is being shared. The victims include not only minors, but also adults, which is why undercover investigations should be expanded to include adult victims as well.
Meanwhile, South Korea unveiled a national cybersecurity basic plan last month, which outlines offensive cyber defense operations and strategies to tackle disinformation, including deepfakes.
Hyung, we can't talk about this issue without addressing teenage offenders. How should the country tackle this issue?
Well, some experts say that reconsidering the age threshold for juvenile criminal responsibility is crucial, while others believe that education should come first. And this is a contentious issue because over 80% of suspects are teens, with about 2 in 10 below the legal age for prosecution. And the experts suggested that reforming the juvenile justice system should take priority over punishment or education. Take a listen.
Juvenile justice system needs comprehensive reform ahead of any punishment or education. With improved infrastructure, we can effectively punish or educate the youth offenders of deepfake crimes.
And would you elaborate on the support that victims can receive through the Victim Advocacy Center that you mentioned in your report?
Of course, Jungmin. The Advocacy Center for Online Sexual Abuse Victims supports both South Korean citizens and foreign residents by assisting with deepfake content removal and offering counseling. And it's best to contact the center by phone, but victims can also use the online bulletin board. And before I wrap up my coverage tonight, one last thing I'd like to share from the center is the issue of secondary victimization. The official said that when victims are blamed, they may hesitate to report their experiences, leading to unreported crimes and allowing perpetrators to commit more crimes. So it is important to improve awareness of this issue.
All right. Hyung, thanks for your report today.
My pleasure.
After a chilly morning, the temperature rose to around 24 degrees Celsius in the middle of the day in Seoul. We'll see clear skies tomorrow as well. In particular, temperatures in the central parts of the country will be higher than today, so it will feel a little hot. The daily temperature range is wide, so make sure to bring your jacket on your way to work. The waves will be high on the East Coast by tomorrow. There are places where high waves cross the seashores or breakwaters, so please be careful when approaching the waterfront. Tomorrow's Seoul and Daejeon will start off at 14 degrees. Highs will move up to 25 in Daejeon, Gwangju, Busan, and Jeju. From tomorrow night, starting with Jeju Island, it will rain across the country between Friday and Saturday. Daily highs in Seoul will also fall below 20 degrees from the weekend, and morning temperatures will drop to single digits. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
요즘 한국에선 어떻게 노는지 알려줄까?
한국에선 아이돌이 되어볼 수도 인생 번호를 찾을 수도 있지.
제일 핫한 포토 스팟은 여기.
한국은 분명 너에게 새로운 영감을 줄 거야.
이런 한국 와보지 않고는 모를걸? 진짜 한국에선 어떻게 먹는지 알려줄까? K-바비큐? 신김치랑 먹어야지. 치킨? 치맥 페스티벌은 처음이지. 김치? 종류만큼 먹는 법도 가지각색. 김밥? 시장에선, 산에선, 바다에선 이렇게. 국밥? 취향 따라, 입맛 따라. 이런 한국 와보지 않고는 모를걸?
How to survive in Korea. Barbecue restaurants. Step 1. Taking care of your clothes. Put your jacket in the plastic bag. Seal it tight. If the stool flips open, store your clothes inside. Wearing light colors? Grab an apron. It's the best defense against oil splatter and smoke. Step 2. Bottomless side dishes. Basic side dishes at a barbecue restaurant. Eat, and eat as much as you want. Side dishes come with free refills. Oh, and if you don't see this sign, just ask, 사장님, 여기 밑반찬 좀 더 주세요. Simple, isn't it? Step 3. Grilling meat. There are various kinds of samgyeopsal in Korea. Place the meat on the grill. Turn it over when golden. And again when it looks done. Again and again and again. Step 4. Sam style. You aren't taking bites of sam like a taco, are you? In Korea, we have it in one bite. A pro tip here. Add only as much as you can handle in a bite. Gotta avoid awkward situations. Step 5. Enjoy the perks. After the meal, enjoy the perks offered as a Korean restaurant. Fabric refreshers get rid of the barbecue smell, while mint candies freshen your breath. Did you survive the barbecue restaurant? Hang on. Are you here with someone you want to impress? Then let's skip the garlic. Who knows what will happen?
진짜 한국에선 어떻게 먹는지 알려줄까? K-바비큐? 신김치랑 먹어야지. 치킨? 치맥 페스티벌은 처음이지. 김치? 종류만큼 먹는 법도 가지각색. 김밥? 시장에선, 산에선, 바다에선 이렇게. 국밥? 취향 따라, 입맛 따라. 이런 한국 와보지 않고는 모를걸?
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve into the most up-to-date issues across the globe. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Today marks World Food Day, a day designated to promote awareness and action in support of the millions of people worldwide who suffer from hunger and malnutrition. Though notable populations in many countries are suffering from chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol, partly due to hypernutrition, many people from the other side of the world are still suffering from hunger and starvation. About 10% of the global population is experiencing famine, which means about 800 million are starving. And with worsening climate change and ongoing conflicts across the globe, the situation seems to be getting worse. In light of the occasion, we will take a closer look at the current food crisis and speak to an expert about possible solutions to tackle the situation. For this, we are joined by the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development of the UN, Alvaro Alario, with us. Welcome to the program, Mr. Alario.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming in. So first, for our viewers, could you give us an explanation of what the International Fund for Agricultural Development is and also on its role?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, we invest in the first mile. That means where food is being produced. And usually this is mostly in rural areas. At the same time, in rural areas is also where poverty is concentrated. So for us, it's an investment in these hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers in providing them access to land, access to water, access to finance, access to credit, and many times linking them to the global value chains, because in many cases they are not able to really connect to these global value chains. For us, we really invest in the rural communities, in the small-scale farmers across the entire world.
Right. So before we get into the details of the food crisis, we hear it's your first visit to South Korea.
That's correct, yes.
What are the reasons behind your visit?
Well, Korea is a founding member of IFAD, and they have been very much supporting IFAD in a variety of manners. And for me, it's very important to try to get more connection with the current government and see how we can co-invest in many parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, in Africa, and we very much count on their support and their leadership in many cases in terms of development, and their interest also, given what Korea has been going through the last decades. I think it's a great example of how we can really increase production, productivity, and tackle poverty and hunger.
Right. So it could be a very meaningful visit for you and also for South Korea as well. Mr. Alario, there are growing concerns about the global food crisis becoming a long-term problem. Before we delve into the causes, can you tell us how severe is the situation regarding food insecurity around the world?
Well, as you mentioned, over the last decades, we have had a declining trend in terms of hunger and poverty. We have gone from almost 1 in 3 of the population being hunger and poor to now 1 in 10, so that's good news. Unfortunately, after COVID, we have seen over 100 million going backwards and going once more into malnutrition, poverty, hunger. So the current data, unfortunately, are not very positive. I think that's why we need to readdress and rethink how we can invest more into these rural areas where poverty is concentrated.
Right. We will touch upon global issues like the pandemic again as we speak. There have been several crises in the past few years. Climate change, pandemic, Ukraine war. These have affected food security across the world. How can we address these kinds of problems? It's kind of inevitable for us.
That's a very good point. I think what we need to address actually is the root causes of poverty and food insecurity. Many times we invest a lot into the humanitarian space after the crisis has happened, after the conflict has happened, after the extreme weather event has happened. But we need to invest in resilience. That means in making sure that these populations are ready for when the shock happens. And that means also tackling a lot of the root causes. What we saw after the COVID crisis is that many of the heads of state, especially in Africa, realized that they needed to become self-sufficient. That what was happening 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers away, it was affecting how they could really tackle a lot of the hunger issues in their own populations. And I think a very good example is South Korea, for sure, in terms of the self-reliance on rice. And I think there's a lot of countries that can also increase their local production, diversify in terms of crops, integrate into the regional markets. And all of this needs to happen putting the small-scale farmers at the center, because this is where hundreds of millions of jobs are being created, and we need to go from, I would say, we need to invest in where the food is being produced, which is that first mile.
Right, so in order to solve this problem, we have to go into the root cause, which is production. Right.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Now, South Korea is a founding member of IFAD, and we want to ask, how is South Korea currently supporting IFAD's initiatives, and can you elaborate on the partnership between IFAD and South Korea?
So South Korea is one of the donors of IFAD, but that's just one small part. I think the most important part is how can we co-invest, how can we have some of the lessons learned from Korea in its development vis-a-vis technology, vis-a-vis rice seeds, for example. How can we also transfer that type of knowledge into other countries? A very good initiative, for example, is the Kai Race project in terms of trying to use a lot of the seeds and the technology that South Korea has developed into African countries. At the same time, we believe that there's also a community-driven approach that happened during I would say, the development of Korea, the New Village Initiative. I think that community-based and that rural development can also serve as a lesson learned for the rest of the world.
Right, so you've mentioned the K Rice Belt project. Then how do you assess efforts towards achieving food security and sustainable agriculture efforts of South Korea? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this is a great program by which South Korea is trying to get some of the high-yielding rice seeds, some of the advances in agriculture productivity to a number of African countries. And they are being quite ambitious. I think IFAD can certainly support these efforts and also diversify them away of not only rice, but there's other crops that we can also support many of the African countries and low-income countries into becoming self-sufficient, which is an important part of the objective.
Right. So we've mentioned some projects that go along with South Korea. Then can we ask how important is cooperation with Korea and for IFAD? And furthermore, taking a step more, what more areas could we cooperate further?
So I think one of them, and today I was, for example, with the Korean Development Agency president or Korean Export-Import Bank, you have a number of institutions which are making great investments across the world. What for us it's important is that those investments are not only in infrastructure or energy, which are very important also, because if you produce food, you need also roads, you need energy you need cold storage, so there's a lot of other aspects and sectors that need to be invested. But the most important part is that these investments go to the small-scale producers, to the small-scale fishermen, and I think that's where a combination, I would say, of having bigger companies, for example, from South Korea, integrating small-scale farmers and fishermen from this type of countries, low-income countries, would be important. That connection, I think, we can also support in these investments.
Right. And also at the COP28 last year in Dubai, a commitment was made to mobilize $2.5 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and protect the lives of farmers threatened by climate change. Do you consider this enough? And also, what efforts would be necessary to ensure that these funds are used where they're most needed?
So agriculture, as everybody knows, is one of the producers of greenhouse emissions. At the same time, it can be also part of the solution. The way that, for example, you produce rice can be done with more or less impact towards climate. And I think what is important is to recognize that we can produce food in a more sustainable manner and also in a way that also preserves and supports nature. To do that, it's very important that we also invest in adaptation. Unfortunately, for every dollar that is invested into adaptation, there's $12 into mitigation. And at the same time, small-scale farmers across the world are the ones who are suffering about the floods, the droughts, the extreme heat. So we need to also invest right now in supporting many of these farmers. Let me give you just one figure. Currently, out of the entire hundreds of billions and trillions that go into climate finance, less than 1% goes to small-scale farmers. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that need solutions right now.
Then can I also ask, what do the majority of the funds, where do the majority of the funds go?
Well, most of it is actually into mitigation, which is very important to address the long-term also structural needs. It's into the energy transition, but very few to actually solve the problems that hundreds of millions of people have right now, because they need solutions to adapt right now. For example, we need drought-resistant seeds. We need also weather alarm systems that can also prevent and get some of the populations ready for when things happen. We need submergible roads. We need ways to adapt right now. We cannot wait for the next years. The hundreds of millions of people who are suffering now cannot wait.
Then what kind of efforts has IFAD made to address food crisis and alleviate poverty in developing countries?
So we invest in the first mile, but not only on production and productivity, but also on connecting farmers many times to the markets, on making sure that they are resilient towards investments in climate adaptation when these shocks happen. Let me give you figures. Over the last 3 years, for example, we increased the income of 77 million small-scale farmers. We increased the access to markets, because it is important not only to produce, but to sell it, to have an income generation activity of 64 million. We increased the production of 62 million rural women and men over the world. So the impact that we have measured and the impact that we are producing is there, but we need to scale it up, and we need to do it very fast because of the figures you started the interview with. 800 million are currently suffering, and there's a moral obligation, but also an investment case to invest in these hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers.
Right, so we keep emphasizing that the support towards small-scale farmers are very important. Alongside that, do you have any other points to emphasize, like which support is very important?
Well, when we are talking about, before we talked about hunger and poverty, I would say that investments in agriculture growth can create up to three times more of jobs and also decrease poverty than in other sectors. So actually these investments in agriculture create long-term resilience and also help feed a lot of the population. So it's also very important that these farmers get a fair share. So for every dollar when we go to the shop and we buy, they get like 6.5 cents out of this. So it's important that across the value chain they also get a fair price and a fair share of the overall, because if we invest in these communities, that will prevent a lot of the forced migration, a lot of the suffering. Otherwise, we will continue pouring hundreds of billions into humanitarian assistance. So the only way to avoid that is to invest right now into the root causes.
Right. Can you also give us some more of your accomplishments of IFAD that helped alleviate food crisis?
Yeah, so I would say a very important part is the tens of millions of, I would say, increases in income. That changes many times also the dynamics in the community. It changes the relationship between the women and the men. It changes the opportunities and the hope of the youth, because many times this is their only way of generating income and being able to stay where they are. So I think by investing in this type of programs and these investments, you can really avoid future costs and also make sure that they have an opportunity and hope in terms of their own future, and in order to drive their own livelihoods and to create these opportunities that otherwise they would not have.
So this is the global food crisis is going internationally. It's a very important issue across the world, especially now that conflicts has been rising. Would you like to leave us a message to convey to governments and stakeholders about the urgency of addressing this food crisis?
Well, we're seeing that a lot of heads of state actually are currently talking about food security as a matter of national security, which I think it's important, because it's important that many countries have the ability of producing their own food, but also of diversifying across the food. Otherwise, they will, anytime there's a shock, a climate shock, anytime there's any type of conflict, they will be affected, their population will be affected. So I think it's important that we integrate a lot of this regional food production at the same time that every country also thinks carefully about what they would like to be self-sufficient in and invest, because it's very important to invest. Without the investment, everything will be just talk. So it's very important that we invest in the right technologies, in the right access to markets, and sometimes in many low-income countries, this means also investing in roads, investing in ports, Otherwise, it's not possible to export food or to even integrate. So there's a combination of investments that comes together. We call about them investments in food systems, and they go beyond agriculture. It's an ecosystem across many of the sectors. Let me perhaps finalize also with 2 points. I mean, at the end of the day, agriculture and farming is a business. And there's 2 components that are very important. One is access to water, very clearly. And the other one is access to have a healthy soil. Without a healthy soil, you cannot produce. And we're seeing that soils are getting worse, and access to water, unfortunately, is becoming more intermittent. So we need investments in how to capture, manage water, but also in making sure that we're working with nature and that we have healthy soils in order to continue having food and products that are also nutritious, which is also a very important component.
Right. Mr. Lau, you gave us your final words, but can I just ask one more question?
Of course.
You mentioned like these kinds of supports are necessary and investments are necessary in a bigger level, but what about for us, like individuals? Could we be of some help to tackling global food crisis? What are some ways that we could practice in our daily lives that could at least give a helping hand to that?
That's a great question. I think we have the power as consumers to really select the type of, I would say, fruits, vegetables, meat that we actually eat. It's important to understand that, for example, for every kilo of meat, you are consuming 15,000 of water to produce 1 kilo of meat. It's important to understand that if we are buying fruits and vegetables that are not of the season, this has also an impact. It's important to understand that when we buy local produced food, there's also a consequence in terms of local jobs. So I think there's a lot of choices that as consumers we have. And it's not only for the industry or the big companies. I think we also need to be conscious of the power of our own choices.
Right, so selecting the food that we eat is also very important, and we can also give a helping hand to tackle global food crisis with our very small choices in our daily lives.
Or food waste, for example. It's clear that if we produce or we buy too much food and we waste it, that has a repercussion into the soil, the water, the nature resources that are not unlimited. So it's important that we also are conscious about food waste, food loss.
Right, so eat as much as you can and try not to leave as much as food waste.
Yep.
All right, we will have to conclude our discussion at this point. Mr. Lau, thank you so much for your time and your insights to this very important topic. We look forward to your contributions and your efforts to stabilize food security around the world.
Thank you very much, and happy World Food Day.
Thank you. Now that wraps up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Korea time. Until then, goodbye.
There is no greater blessing than to have